Everybody remembers the giant. Almost nobody remembers that he fell right after mocking the wrong person. And this is where the simple version starts to crack. The story is usually reduced to a few clean images. A giant, a young shepherd, a sling, one stone, and an impossible victory. Simple, memorable, also a little too neat. Because Goliath was not merely large. He was intimidating, loud, overconfident, and very comfortable watching everyone else step backward. He wore heavy armor, carried weapons large enough to make ordinary soldiers reconsider their career choices, and entered the battlefield as though the ending had already been approved. That confidence was not decoration. It was part of the weapon. Goliath's strength was not only in his body, it was in the fear he produced before any fight began. He stepped forward, shouted his challenge, insulted Israel, and watched trained soldiers retreat. No sword had moved. No battle had started. But fear had already done most of the work for him. Every time Goliath spoke, he made himself seem larger. Every time the army backed away, they helped him do it. It was like someone walking into a meeting, speaking louder than everyone else, and somehow convincing the entire room that volume was the same thing as being right. Goliath had mastered that trick. He did not simply challenge Israel. He controlled the atmosphere of the battlefield. He decided when everyone would listen, when everyone would panic, and when everyone would remember how enormous he looked. Day after day, he returned. Day after day, he repeated the same threat. Day after day, the soldiers reacted as though repetition had made him taller. It had not. But intimidation rarely needs new material. It only needs an audience willing to keep believing the old material. The problem was not only Goliath's size, it was the arrogance of thinking size was enough. He had watched people retreat for so long that he stopped considering another possibility. Someone might not. To Goliath, the fear in front of him looked permanent. The army looked frozen. The king looked uncertain. The battlefield looked like his personal stage. And Goliath clearly enjoyed the performance. He had armor, weapons, experience, and a daily speech. The man was basically running a one-person intimidation campaign, and so far, the campaign was doing extremely well. But arrogance has a predictable weakness. It starts confusing repeated success with guaranteed success. Goliath believed everyone would react the same way because everyone had reacted the same way before. Then someone arrived who had not been standing there long enough to accept the giant's version of the story. He came carrying food, no armor, no rank, no official invitation to solve Israel's military disaster. Just bread, supplies, and the unfortunate timing required to hear Goliath speak. He was supposed to deliver lunch, check on his brothers, and leave. Instead, he walked into a battlefield trapped by one arrogant man's voice. And David did not even enter the story as a soldier. Goliath didn't just control the battlefield, he controlled everyone's imagination. Before the stone, before the sling, before David stepped forward, the real damage had already been done. The army was afraid, not briefly, not quietly. They were trapped in it. Every morning Goliath came out and repeated the challenge. Every morning Israel heard the same voice, saw the same armor, measured the same impossible size, and reached the same conclusion. No one could beat him. That conclusion became stronger each time nobody tested it. Goliath understood something useful. A threat repeated often enough starts sounding like a fact. He did more than challenge Israel. He trained them to expect defeat. The soldiers were not waiting for the perfect strategy. They were frozen by intimidation. They had weapons, training, numbers, and a king nearby. But one man had taken control of the field from a safe distance, because apparently listening to a giant humiliate everyone for days was an excellent military strategy, very productive, and very brave, obviously. Each time Goliath spoke, the army backed away. Each time they backed away, he became more confident. It was a perfect system, assuming the goal was to make the problem worse. Fear had frozen them, and every retreat added another layer of shame. By then the camp was not only frightened, it was ashamed of its silence, yet too intimidated to break it. That was how fear became a prison. It spread through the army until it no longer felt like fear. It felt like common sense. Of course no one should fight him, of course he was too strong, of course the challenge was impossible. Intimidation did not need to defeat every soldier. It only needed to convince them that defeat had already happened. The battlefield had become like a room where one aggressive person controlled the conversation because everyone else had stopped interrupting. No one agreed with Goliath, but everyone obeyed the mood he created. That was the crack beneath the famous story. Israel did not lack strong men. It lacked someone willing to look at the threat without accepting the threat's own description of itself. Goliath called himself unbeatable without using the word. His armor said it, his height said it, his voice said it, and the army's silence kept confirming it. Then David arrived. He had not spent weeks watching Goliath perform. He had not learned the routine. He had not stood there every day while fear settled deeper into the camp. He simply heard the giant speak. And because David had not accepted the pattern, he noticed how strange it was. An army was standing still while one man shouted at them. David looked around, listened to the challenge, and reacted with something the battlefield had been missing. Not panic, not admiration. A question. Why was everyone treating this man as though he had already won? The army saw a giant. David saw a man making threats. And then someone finally appeared who did not buy the fear. Then David heard Goliath speak, and unlike everyone else, he was not impressed. That was the moment the story changed. The giant was still large. The armor was still heavy. The challenge was still loud. Nothing on the battlefield had changed, but someone had finally reacted differently. David did not hear an unbeatable warrior. He heard a man insulting Israel and acting as though nobody would answer, so he asked the question everyone else had stopped asking. Why was this man being treated as invincible? David did not arrive with military experience, armor, or the kind of dramatic entrance that usually announces a hero. He arrived with food for his brothers and enough distance from the panic to notice that the situation had become strange. Thousands of soldiers were armed. One giant was talking, and somehow the giant had become the only person controlling the day. David basically arrived late to the chaos and asked why everyone was still following Goliath's script. That question mattered because fear had turned the giant's opinion of himself into the army's opinion of him. Goliath believed he could not be challenged. The soldiers had started believing it too. David did not. Sometimes the power of a threat depends less on its actual size and more on how many people agree to be afraid of it. David broke that agreement. He began asking what would happen to the man who defeated Goliath. The soldiers answered, but their tone made one thing clear. They still thought the question was theoretical. David did not. His brother Eliab heard him talking and became angry. He accused David of abandoning the sheep just to watch the battle. This was useful because apparently the army had found someone it was willing to confront. Not Goliath. David. Eliab saw an annoying younger brother asking reckless questions. David saw an army explaining why nothing could be done, and David refused to join the explanation. He turned away and asked someone else. The answer stayed the same. So did his question. That persistence began to attract attention. Soon, David's words reached King Saul, and the shepherd who had arrived with lunch was brought before the man responsible for the entire army. David told Saul that no one should lose heart because of Goliath. Saul looked at David and immediately noticed the obvious problem. David was young. Goliath had been fighting for years. It was not the comparison a nervous king had been hoping to see, but David was not measuring the battle the way Saul was measuring it. Saul saw age, armor, height, and experience. David saw a real threat that everyone had allowed to define the entire battle. For the first time, the giant's size was no longer the only thing shaping what happened next on that field. That alone was enough to make the coming fight feel different. The confrontation had not started yet, but the narrative had already changed. And then Goliath looked at David and made the classic mistake. Saul tried to prepare David for battle in the most obvious way possible. He gave him armor. It made sense. Goliath had armor, so David should have armor too. That was how everyone had been measuring the problem from the beginning. Match size with size, weight with weight, metal with more metal. David put it on, moved a few steps, and immediately realized he could barely move. Very promising. So he took it off. He chose what he actually knew, his staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones from the stream. Then he walked toward Goliath. And this was where arrogance stopped being a speech and became an exposure. Goliath saw David coming and looked offended. Not afraid, offended. From his perspective, this was not a serious opponent. David was young, lightly equipped, and carrying none of the symbols Goliath respected. No heavy armor, no giant sword, no impressive military entrance, just a shepherd walking forward with a sling. Goliath had spent days demanding a champion, and Israel had finally sent him someone who looked like he had taken a wrong turn while delivering lunch. So he mocked him. He asked whether he was a dog being approached with sticks. He cursed David and promised to leave his body for the birds and wild animals. The giant was still performing. He had an audience, a large voice, and one final speech to deliver before the victory he had already imagined. But he was so confident in his own size that he missed the small detail in David's hand. A stone, not an army, not a massive weapon, not a complicated strategy. One stone. David answered, but he did not stay in place for a long exchange of threats. While Goliath moved forward, David ran toward the battle line. That detail mattered. The army had spent days stepping backward. David moved forward. He reached into the bag, placed a stone in the sling, and sent it toward the only exposed place that mattered. The stone struck Goliath in the forehead. The giant stopped. Then he fell face first to the ground. The man who had filled the valley with noise was suddenly silent. For the first time, the army saw Goliath from another angle, not as an impossible force, but as a man who had made one fatal assumption publicly. That was the irony. Goliath had dismissed David because he looked too small to be dangerous. Then he was defeated by something too small for him to respect. This was not only an unexpected victory, it was arrogance being exposed by the detail it had ignored. It was like someone spending an entire meeting dismissing the quietest person in the room, only to discover that person had the one solution everyone needed. The famous scene was not the beginning. It was the evidence. The valley had finally seen the difference clearly. Goliath mocked. David advanced. And one stone ended the speech. The giant fell before his arrogance could explain what had happened. Goliath mocked David, but one stone proved that arrogance was not armor. That was the center of the story. Goliath had size, weapons, experience, reputation, and a voice powerful enough to control an entire valley, but he also had one enormous blind spot. He believed only something large could threaten him. That assumption shaped everything. It was why he laughed when David approached. It was why he saw the sling but did not respect it. It was why he kept speaking when the battle had already moved beyond words. Goliath judged danger by appearance. David judged the battle by direction. That difference decided everything. David did not win because he looked stronger. He did not win because the armor suddenly fit, because the army finally became brave, or because Goliath became less dangerous. He won because he saw the confrontation differently. The army had spent days looking up at Goliath and accepting the view from below. David refused that angle. He saw a real threat, but not an invincible one. He saw armor, but also an opening. He saw noise, but not authority. He saw a giant who had become so comfortable being feared that he no longer noticed what he was ignoring. And arrogance usually misses what it considers too small to matter. That was the real weakness. Goliath had spent days proving that he could dominate attention. David needed only a moment of precision. The story was not merely about the small defeating the great. It was about the arrogant being exposed by the detail he dismissed. Not every threat is as invincible as it appears. Sometimes it only looks enormous because everyone has agreed to look at it from the ground. Goliath had trained the army to see him as the whole battlefield. David saw one man standing in it. It was like an impressive building collapsing because nobody respected the crack beneath its polished surface. The height was real, the strength was real, but so was the crack, and David noticed it. That is why the stone mattered beyond the moment it struck. It did not make David powerful. It revealed that Goliath had never been as untouchable as fear had made him seem. The stone did not create the weakness. It exposed it in front of everyone. Goliath had the speech. David had direction. Goliath had size. David had precision. Goliath had arrogance. David had one stone. That was all it took to end the performance. The giant who had spent days speaking as though the outcome belonged to him could not control the only moment that mattered. He mocked David because David did not look dangerous. Then David moved forward, released the stone, and ended the argument before Goliath could add another sentence. The valley had heard enough. Everyone there had. Goliath mocked David. But one stone was enough to silence the giant. Which misunderstood Bible story should be simplified next? Saul, Samson, or Elijah?